All right, good morning. I'm Leila Abed, Director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. And on behalf of the Mexico and Canada Institutes, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Since coming into force on July 1st, 2020, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, also known as a USMCA, has produced remarkable results for all three countries. The USMCA's legal and regulatory framework has expanded trade, investment, and jobs, and has provided mechanisms to resolve trade disputes and differences. In 2023, the total value of trade within North America exceeded $1.88 trillion, positioning Mexico and Canada as the US's top trading partners for the first time since 2002, surpassing China. Goods and services trade within North America soared by 50%, and investment in new ventures grew by 136%. USMCA represents 1/3 of the world's GDP, and it impacts an estimated 500 million people. It has increased the region's competitiveness vis-a-vis other global trading blocs, strengthening the partnership between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. That said, pending trade disputes, geopolitical tensions, countering China's growing influence, distinct domestic political objectives, and other national security concerns persist ahead of the agreement's first review process, which is set to occur in 2026. As presidential elections in Mexico and the United States have concluded, with the inauguration here in the United States happening next week, and with elections in Canada set to occur this year, the three parties have a unique opportunity to reflect on the positive results achieved as well as ongoing challenges. Soundly managing the 2026 trilateral review process will require establishing consensus on the specific criteria for measuring the agreement's effectiveness and the necessary actions needed to integrate each country's concerns and recommendations. Given the different political contexts of each country, and with trade liberalization facing growing concerns, reducing uncertainty and ensuring clarity of the review process will increase the possibilities of a positive outcome for the future of North America. The Wilson Center's Mexico and Canada Institutes published a report in November titled A Practical Guide to the USMCA Review, Three Principles and 5 Rules for Success. The authors of this report join us today to present the findings of the report and to discuss the different scenarios that could arise during the 2026 review process. For those interested in reading the report, you can access the document on the Mexico and Canada Institute's websites. I would like to thank all of our panelists today, especially Ambassador Tony Wayne, Juan Carlos Baker, and Diego Marroquin, for authoring this incredible report, and to Steve and Shauna for sharing their insights and knowledge with our audience this morning. And with that, I turn it over to Diego, who will be serving as our moderator for today's discussion. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you so much, Lila. And I want to thank the Mexico and the Canada Institute for their generous support and leadership in helping me make this conversation. I want to start us really quick, just to get people interested. I want to ask a quick fire question to each of the panelists here. And Lila, if she wants to respond as well. I want a yes or no answer. Will President Trump impose tariffs starting January 20? I'll start with Lila if she wants to answer the question.
I think that's the big question on the horizon, Diego. We won't know until probably January 20th. I think the expectation, according to some analysts, is that at the very onset of the Trump administration, we could see the imposition of a 25% blanket tariff on all Mexican imports. And I'll speak on Mexico so that others can chime in on Canada. And that gradually that could be reduced. They could either be lifted, or that they could be imposed to certain selected products, and they would be around between 5 to 10%. Regardless, the imposition of tariffs is obviously in violation of USMCA, and I think it would have deep ramifications, consequences, and impacts for all three countries, especially for the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship. So we're all closely monitoring and keeping our eyes out for what happens on the first day of the Trump administration, and I look forward to hearing everybody's insights on this issue.
Thank you, Lila. Ambassador Wayne, yes or no? What do you think?
Well, he's certainly going to indicate the threat of doing so and steps to do so. Whether he actually gets through to having them go into place, we'll have to see. If he does put them in place, there will be a response from Canada and Mexico. They will put in equally onerous tariffs on their side. So it won't be a good start to negotiations. Trump has talked about putting tariffs in place having to do with migration and other non-trade related issues that might come up. So we'll just have to see.
So two potential soft yeses, I take. Juan Carlos, what do you think? Yes or no?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm overwhelmed by the massive response that our event generated. Thank you all for being here. Yes, but let me put a caveat on that. I believe that in my mind, the most likely scenario is that Donald Trump will do what he did back in 2018 when the Section 232 tariffs started on steel and aluminum. That is to say, sign an executive order saying that tariffs are coming, but for the time being, given that the US is engaging, that's what he said back then, given that the US is engaged in conversations with Mexico and Canada, those tariffs will be suspended, prevented that Mexico or Canada, for that matter, will come successfully out of a negotiation with him. So I think that he will have the stick, but he might not strike immediately. But for all intent and purposes, there will be an executive order saying that tariffs are there.
Now turning to my Canadian friends, Steve, what do you think?
Well, I think everything we've been hearing is that he will move to impose the tariffs on day one. That might take a day or two to be put into place, but we've certainly been hearing that that's the plan. As a result, Canada is preparing to be able to respond very quickly.
Perfect. And Ambassador Hemingway, what do you think?
I'm afraid yes, and likely with a twist, as you've heard.
So multiple yeses with twists. That's good. We're done with the first part. And now we are going to move on to three blocks of conversation. The first one, I want our expert panels here to give us some context about what has happened in each of the three countries and their industries. Then we will move on and talk a little bit about tariffs. And the third section will deal more with the way forward and how can we improve this situation. So starting the first block, I want to turn back to Ambassador Wayne. In 5 minutes, Ambassador Wayne, could you share some insights about the new Trump administration and the Republican Congress? How do you think Trump 2.0 will differ from his first term? And what can you tell us about the new trade representative and the strategies that they might implement regarding Mexico and Canada?
Well, I think we're going to have to be ready for reactions against the two neighboring countries based not on the trade agreement. Before we get to the trade agreement, Trump is going to want to act based on what Mexico is doing vis-a-vis people intending to migrate illegally to the United States. He's going to want to move on that. He's also going to look at what Mexico and Canada, both of them, are going to do on criminal activities and criminal groups trying to send illegal drugs and other mostly illegal drugs into the United States. That's going to be sort of a preliminary block. So I think that's going to stop us actually getting directly to a number of the trade issues. And we'll have to see how complicated that gets, but he's promised to do that. So everybody wants to get to the trade issues, including me, has to pay a lot of attention to this, but it might be a while until it's clarified exactly if he's going to let the trade discussions come to some sort of fruition or move forward in a certain way.
All right. Juan Carlos, I want to go to Mexico and talk a little bit about what has Mexico done to prepare for the new changing government in the U.S.? What has the Mexico trade team has done specifically to prepare for the review? If you could talk a little bit about the constitutional reforms, what's their status and how they can impact Mexico's position with Canada and the U.S. And just a few days ago, President Sheinbaum announced the Plan Mexico. Are there any points there worth mentioning in this context?
Sure. Well, thank you for that. Several angles to cover. I would probably begin by saying that since the last time that we spoke last year, everything in Mexico has been about Donald Trump. What is he going to do? How are we going to, as a country, address the challenges that he represents? Obviously, we have gone back to that practice that I gladly had forgotten about of checking social media every day as soon as I wake up, just to see, what has happened. But in terms of actual developments, I believe that perhaps the most important is how, at least, it's not really structured, but we have seen in Mexico signals of the Mexican government moving towards identifying some topics, some actions that address or are perhaps an indirect response to the preoccupations that Donald Trump has been voicing for the past few months. So, for example, we have seen some raids on a couple of cities in Mexico targeting illegal goods, most of them Chinese. We have also seen how the speech, the narrative on migration starts to change from an absolute no to receiving deportees to a potential maybe, depending on the conditions and what had not. So all of that, I'm understanding that as a signals, again, that the Mexican government is sending to the future Trump administration in order to show its disposition, Mexico's disposition, to sit down and have a deal, whatever that means. No, and that takes me to the other second element, which is related to your first question. The one about tariffs or not. I believe that it's important to make a very key difference, at least to me, is that this time around, if you remember in Trump 1.0, he immediately went after the NAFTA. He labeled and framed the NAFTA as the worst trade agreement ever negotiated, and his intention was to destroy it. He actually voiced it as such. In this occasion, it seems that at least for the case of Mexico, Donald Trump is trying to use tariffs as a weapon to get Mexico to do what he wishes to be done in other areas of the bilateral relationship. So tariffs or the economy per se, and I agree with Tony Wayne that these issues will come up to the surface in time. But right now, the focus of the U.S. administration will be rather to produce actionable items, at least in Trump's perspective, from Trump's perspective, on migration, security, drugs. And that is probably more perverse because we don't really know what the metrics will be. So if we get, I'm obviously speaking out of the blue, if we get 1 million deportees, then we get off the hook on tariffs. What if we get 2 million? Well, you see, it will be moving the goalpost time and again. So in that sense, and I will stop here, I believe that in Mexico, the question or the public debates really as to what will happen beginning from next Monday is, really how creative Mexico can be in pulling out magic tricks time and again so that Trump's most radical ideas are kept away. But that in of itself is a challenge. How many rabbits can we pull out of the hat? And how often are we going to be able to do that? No. And I have a couple of comments on Plan Mexico, but I'll save those for the next round of interventions because I believe that we should be seeing the Plan Mexico as a response to some of the concerns that the U.S. has voiced regarding, potential Chinese presence in Mexico and others.
Perfect timing, and that was very interesting. I want to hear you talk a little bit about Plan Mexico. Many can argue that the review process has already started, and we're 2 years, or just 1 year away. Ambassador Hemingway, I want to talk a little bit about the private sector. Could you give us an industry update, particularly now that we finally have Mexico-Canada CEO dialogue? We just had it this week. What was your reaction to this development, especially in the context of a lack of institutional conversation and dialogue between Mexico and Canada? And could you tell us a little bit about what has the industry done to prepare for potential tariffs?
Yes, no, thank you, Diego. And I want to thank as well the Wilson Center for bringing these discussions together and for always keeping it trilateral, right? I think we run the risk of getting distracted by the bilateral elements, which are important and can't be ignored for sure. But if we lose the trilateral dialogue, I think we're going to lose the big picture here. And I think that's going to have an impact, not just in the short term, but this is a change in vision that could affect all of us and all across all of our communities and society at a much deeper level. On the Canadian business perspective in particular, Canadian business has long been very active in Mexico, long been very optimistic about the bilateral relationship. And I think at times they tend to do so in a quiet manner and often aren't necessarily recognized as Canadian companies. But we have a huge interest and presence in all three countries, of course. And I think we'll see business be engaged and, they're just putting their heads down and getting to work, right, for the benefit and prosperity of our countries and also for the people that live in all three countries. So they'll make adjustments, and they have made adjustments over the years constantly to policy changes. I think what business always looks for is they want, policy certainty rather than any particular policy. So, governments will make decisions and pursue what's in the interest of their countries, and business will adapt. And I think we've seen that with the Canadian business community, particularly in North America, that they adapt to what's presented. But the more stability, the more transparency, the more conversations we can have, the easier we make it for them to drive growth and build prosperity for the benefit of all of us. The commitment of the Canadian private sector to the Mexico market in particular, I think, was demonstrated very clearly by the quality of the Business Council of Canada delegation that we had come down yesterday to meet with President Sheinbaum and key members of her cabinet. We had, CN, Scotiabank, Linamar, Martin Ray, Palliser, TC Energy, Tech Resources, WestJet, and Nutrien. And they're the CEOs of big companies with big interests that employ a lot of people and generate salaries and income for people in all three countries. And of course, the majority in Mexico are Mexican employees, the vast majority, often up to 99% of those benefiting from the company's activities here. So they're engaged, they're invested, they're looking at the long term. Business wants to create and build in environments that are welcoming to them. We saw a great welcome yesterday from the Mexican president, the secretaries, and also business leaders. And I think what we need is we really need to understand each other better. And I think that came out in the communique that we issued last night. We're seeing, across the world, solidification of trading blocs and political alliances. And we need to, in North America, to strengthen our resiliency and our competitiveness as a region. And I think we've seen over the last few months the impact on how resilient are we? And we saw this during the pandemic, and we're seeing this today in terms of are we resilient? We still haven't achieved what we can achieve on the resiliency front in North America. We need to strengthen what we've already built. And I just to sort of sum up, I want to emphasize something that emerged in the statement yesterday, the joint statement between the Business Council of Canada and the CCE of Mexico. And they talked about prioritizing dialogue, right? Avoiding trade tensions and working together on constructive solutions that promote free trade and help position North America, in the world. And I think that's a really key message from the business community as to where they are and what they're seeing. The resiliency, we haven't seen that at a macro level. Companies are resilient and companies are adjusting. And I think you're talking about that a little bit. What are companies doing to prepare? And they are on the micro level. But what we need to do is build that macro resiliency within North America. In good times, the connections may wane a bit. The dialogue becomes a bit more narrow sometimes when things are going well. But in challenging times, we need to make sure those connections are really strong. And I think what we saw yesterday is that private sectors in the two countries are very motivated to make those connections strong. And we really want the U.S. private sector as well to be part of that conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much on that. I think you hit a key point there. We want to keep business engaged because in the end, they're the real users of USMCA. And lastly, Steve, I want to talk a little bit about politics. The fun thing is that Mexico sometimes is talked about as the squeaky wheel of the trilateral relationship, but there's been a lot of noise coming from Canada as of lately. Could you explain the implications of Prime Minister Trudeau stepping down and Minister Freeland resigning? How can Canada face tariffs with weakened leadership and upcoming elections? And what are your thoughts regarding the meeting between Prime Minister Trudeau and the premiers yesterday, especially in the context of Alberta potentially going rogue compared to its other provinces in Canada?
Yeah, thanks, Diego. Clearly, we're not in a position that we'd like to be in at this point in time, with former Finance Minister Freeland stepping down about a month ago from her position just as she was about to deliver a fall economic statement. And then following that, the resignation announcement for the Prime Minister has given the perception that we're in a bit of a leadership vacuum. And we also have a leadership contest about to get underway to come up with a new leader for the Liberal Party. So all of that, far from ideal. I think that we would have preferred for this to happen virtually any other time than right now. But having said that, we have to deal with it. So we have to move forward. And I think given the kind of threat we're facing with 25% tariffs across the board, that is starting to focus minds a lot more at this point. And particularly in the context of 25% tariffs across the board. I mean, Canada and Mexico will have worse access to the US than all of the WTO members, all 166. They're facing tariffs on average into the US of 2.5%. So the US, if they go ahead, is taking action that will treat its closest trading partners as, providing them with the worst treatment across the board of virtually any country other than Russia, North Korea, and a handful of others. And that, I think, is starting to have the effect of bringing Canadians together. Industry and labor have been taking actions to coordinate and unify among themselves. The government is trying to do that as well. You mentioned the meeting with the Prime Minister, some cabinet ministers, and provincial premiers yesterday. Yes, there was a bit of division, but they fully agreed on the approach to trying to address issues at the border, trying to pursue common efforts on advocacy in the US to try to get this turned off. And they've gone a long ways down the track with respect to developing Canada's approach, including retaliation and other measures that Canada would take in response if the US does this. Alberta has taken a different path. It's unfortunate that this is being all aired in public rather than behind closed doors. But we will have to deal with that. And I think there will be an effort to try to get some greater unity on the Canadian side. So that's going to be the short-term objective. But I think by Monday, we will be ready. And there will be a lot of actions ready to go if the U.S. does proceed with 25% tariff.
That's a good segue, Steve. Because before we move, now that we're moving on to the second block, I want to go back to you again and talk about these actions. I think Premier Ford yesterday mentioned that Canada was ready to use every tool in its toolbox, but it would be great for the audience and for myself as well to know what exactly is in this toolbox and what series of actions could Canada implement should the US implement either a 5% tariff for specific goods or a 25% tariff across the board? And what are the implications for Canada and for Mexico should that take place?
Well, I think what we've been preparing for on the Canadian side is the possibility of 25% tariffs across the board applying to all imports. And so that's what has been prepared in terms of a potential Canadian response. There's been an effort to try to get some traction in discussions with members of the Trump team coming in. That's been less than successful. I think that there's also ongoing advocacy to try to get U.S. business, U.S. leaders to support our kind of position, because I think we foresee a lot of damage to their interest going forward. But obviously, we're spending a lot of time on what kind of retaliatory actions we will take. There will be a draft retaliation list that will be ready to go if President Trump does proceed with implementing the tariffs. And it won't be just simply a retaliation list, although it will be a very strong retaliation list. But we're also looking at other measures, and those are going to be focused on some of our key points of leverage: energy, critical minerals, various natural resources that the U.S. does not produce enough to supply its own needs, and they rely heavily on Canada for much of this. The part that I think concerns us the most is that the U.S. is imposing these tariffs against us, potentially, and Mexico, while leaving countries like China, Venezuela, others that are not really U.S. allies, and that's where they're going to have to turn if they're looking for a lot of the resources that we have to face these kinds of barriers into the U.S. Then they're going to have to go to China. They're going to have to go to Venezuela. They're going to have to go to other areas, and we don't think that's really what the U.S. is looking for at this point. So we're hoping there's still a possibility to find an off-ramp on all this.
I hope so as well, and that's a great point. Tariffs are not only inflationary, they'll make goods more expensive for US consumers, but also for Canadian and Mexican families. But they're also anti-competitive. They will make our industries less competitive vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, and as you said, even Venezuela. Juan Carlos, I want to hear what you have to say about the Plan Mexico, but also want to ask you, because you made a really good point before talking about having the trade agenda separate from other issues like security and immigration. That was largely what we did during the renegotiation of NAFTA. Will we be able to do that again with USMCA, or do you think this new Trump administration will try to leverage all issues simultaneously?
Let me start backwards. I think that during the first USMCA talks, certainly issues, and Steve can testify on this as well, the issues were kept on its own, each one on its own basket. I mean, I don't recall it never that we started or that the US crossed issues in the sense of either you accept this rule of origin or tomorrow you're going to have X amount of people dropped at the border. That never happened back then, right? But certainly, Trump being Trump, he found ways to start, knitting together all those issues. And I believe that, at least from the Mexican perspective, on the moment that, and this happened now with the administration of López Obrador, on the moment that, Trump threatened to introduce tariff, save that Mexico was going to start deploying troops in the southern border. Well, on that moment right there, we basically accepted, Mexico and the U.S., that all the issues are intertwined. So I don't believe that this on this occasion, once Trump comes back on beginning next Monday, and he stays there for the next 4 long years, I believe that it's just inevitable that issues will be intertwined. And that takes me back to the comment that I made earlier in terms of how creative Mexico can be in terms of producing these results, these elements, even if they are just for narrative purposes, which sometimes, let's be honest, that's all really what Trump cares about. So yeah, the issues will be knitted together. But on that sense, I prefer to see the sort of optimistic point of view from that perspective, rather than point at the complications on that. I prefer to see that, in a way that has actually expanded the possibilities for Mexico to influence on the outcomes, because now we have more buttons to pull from, right? So if I really want the U.S., and this is where I see the Plan Mexico sort of docking in. If Mexico wishes to, have more participation of U.S. companies or Canadian companies, for that matter, in the development projects, if we are trying to increase the regional production and the regional value content on the products that we are manufacturing in Mexico, so as to avoid third parties, and we know which one the third party is, coming into the country and supplying and so on, well, then that's really what Mexico can do. I will help you out in this topic, even if it's not trade related. But then, in addition, or as a sort of support to the USMCA and its review, we will speak about that in a minute, these are the other policy tools that I have also developed on my own that I believe you should be helping me out so that I can help you out in this other topic. No, and that's why I was saying earlier that to me, the Plan Mexico really is this not so much this guy's way of saying that if there are preoccupations in North America and with our North American partners as to other countries inserting themselves in the supply chains, well, we will make, the Plan Mexico does, a very clear objective to increase regional content, national content, to devote a particular percentage of government procurement to companies, so on and so forth, all those objectives that are there, which I don't believe go against the interest of the US and Canada. We might, my trade students, if there's any in the audience, hello, you better study. But if there's any of my trade students in the audience, they will probably tell me that maybe arguably some of those objectives there go against international commitments and the USMCA itself, and they could be actually right on that. But I believe that as of now, real politics probably have much more relevance than those commitments that they are there. I will never advocate for Mexico to breach its commitments, but I am fully cognizant that there are much more urgent matters at hand to address.
It's interesting to see the interplay between, as you said, political objectives and like compliance on the actual agreement. Ambassador Wayne, I want to talk a little bit about the paper that we wrote. There are basically three scenarios for the USMCA review. The ideal scenario is that we get an immediate extension in 2026. The second scenario is that we go into yearly reviews leading up to a potential expiration of the agreement in 2036. And there's a third scenario that maybe not a lot of people are talking about, but there's also the potential of any party, any country, withdrawing from the agreement by giving the other parties a 6-month notice. Which of these outcomes do you think it's most likely, and what would each mean for North American progress so far?
Well, I think once we get to that broader negotiation, which is going to take into account what Juan Carlos was talking about, is how we deal with the other related issues before we get there. I think the most likely outcome is that we have a graduated, a constant negotiation over the rest of this period of time. I just don't think Trump is going to give away his leverage he'll let things go forward, but he's going to want to maintain that ability to intervene and say, well, I'm going to pull out now unless you do this, in order to maintain sort of that ability to stretch both other parties to get them to do what he wants to do. Now, I think as he goes on a little bit more, he'll get distracted with other things. But in this first period of time, I think we're going to expect to see a continued negotiation. That doesn't mean we aren't going to make progress in all the areas. I think it's quite likely that, in fact, we will have good progress in sorting through both the trade-related but not trade agreement specific issues of how you deal with migration and how you deal with organized crime. And I think both neighbors will be responsive on that. And Trump will be able to point to that to justify his own positions. I think as we get into the USMCA specific areas, you're going to see tougher negotiation. But I think basically you're going to see a negotiation moving in a direction that the United States can say this is positive. And we're all going to we'll all get something here. We're going to get a lot in the United States, but everybody else is going to gain from it too. But I don't think Trump is going to settle in and say this is all fixed until the end of time. I think he's going to keep that hanging there as a potential leverage to be able to push both parties to give more in certain areas, depending how things evolve. And we don't know how things are going to evolve right now. We have a general sense they should continue to move in positive directions, but we don't know who all the other actors are. And there are a lot of independent parties, both in the United States and the two other countries, working on this relationship, working on different sectors And we're just going to watch that. And I think Trump is going to maintain space for his own leverage to negotiate as he moves forward.
And before we move on, I think following what Ambassador Hemingway was saying, I think one of the main takeaways of why USMCA has been so successful is that we have our clear set of rules that are not supposed to change. But if we go into this 10-year, potentially 10-year limbo, like what would that mean for companies that are deciding whether to invest or not in the region? I was having a conversation with someone from the auto sector, and they told me that in order to like come up with a design of a car, then leading up all the way to final production takes 7 to 8 years. I mean, how can a company decide to invest in North America if their investment takes so long to materialize, and they don't know what if the rules of the game are going to change or not? So it's going to be difficult. Ambassador Hemingway, also talking about the review a little bit, what do you think are the main obstacles for the review? I think, at least from my perspective, I think NAFTA's original sin was that we didn't talk publicly and we didn't defend the agreement once it was implemented. We just went on business as usual. And I think that's probably what we have done so far with USMCA as well. We signed the agreement. It was super popular, at least in US Congress, I mean, compared to NAFTA, but we haven't done a good job talking about the real benefits for US families, for workers in Mexico, for farmers in Canada. Do you think that we're repeating the same mistake? And lastly, what compliance issues you found that may obstruct the review?
No, I think you're absolutely right when you put it in that kind of context. Like Juan Carlos and Steve and others who have negotiated these agreements, like it's a tough lift, right, to get to these negotiations and deliver the results. But it's not as if the agreement, sits in the freezer then and just complies. Like these are constantly changing. We're seeing with artificial intelligence and all of these other elements and technology that the implications of the agreement are changing constantly. We have to, exactly as you said, Diego, we have to have those conversations and talking just about Plan Mexico yesterday, hearing from the President Sheinbaum and from Secretary Ebrard, this is what Mexico is looking at. This is what we have planned, and having that transparent conversation and bringing the Canadian delegation into that conversation, I think is critical. We need to deepen those conversations and that dialogue on these issues going forward. And talking about, sort of with compliance and the trade rules, trade rules are only really valuable and useful and meaningful if those who sign up to following them actually do follow them. And I think it's one thing if we come to these agreements or, we create the WTO and we question its relevance, we question whether it is what we need today. But if we don't replace that with something else, then we're really just destroying the institution without having anything else to fall upon as an alternative. And I think we have to be very careful about doing that, right? So destroying the good to try and achieve, better. But if we don't actually achieve the better, let's not replace the good until we have a plan in place. And I think the rhetoric is really important and what we say. And we've had, and you've all mentioned sort of what we're hearing coming out of Washington and the reactions to that. And I think there's a real opportunity for cool-headed minds in Mexico and Canada to convey what they are thinking and to raise that voice. And I think the private sector you'll hear is engaging in that discussion and doesn't need to be confrontational, but we need to have, the reasonable voice needs to be out in the public as well and have those discussions. So I think as we go into the discussions around the USMCA review, that is for me one of the great risks. Are those moderate and fact-based and substantive voices, are they going to be drowned out by other types of rhetoric? And lastly, I think I'd just say that we often talk about these trade agreements and in the North America context that we're looking for win-win-win, as if that's a lofty dream and a lofty ambition. It's actually essential to all three countries. The win-win-win, it has to be. There's no way to achieve an agreement without that being part of it. It has to be a win-win-win. So we should stop sort of talking about it as if that's an unattainable dream and recognize that that is the goal. And in all that we're doing, that should be the solution that we're looking for. But
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hemingway. I think also talking about constructed conversations, I want to move on to the paper before we head out to the last section of the panel. I think in order to have that constructed conversation, we need to have a certain framework. And I think that's one of the things that we approached on the paper that we wrote. I don't know, Juan Carlos or Ambassador Wayne, do you want to talk a little bit about this framework and how can we better move the conversation forward when we get to that point?
Well, if I may, sure. Just two brief comments. I know that with everything that it's been, and I fully endorse what Shona you said. I mean, we cannot go around, and that's what I said. I will never advocate for a breach in obligations of Mexico, which is my country. But obviously, I believe that this applies to everyone else. And I know that when we see everything that the turmoil and all the confusion that right now is common, speaking about principles, speaking about the USMCA review in 2026, all of that, it sounds sort of counterintuitive, no? And some people in the audience, I believe, would rightly push or say in saying, I mean, how can you really even imagine the future negotiation as a optimistic, forward-looking process given how Trump is, right? So that all of that exists and is true. But I believe that precisely because of that reason, it is even more relevant now that we, businessmen, the business communities, academics, legislators, the stakeholders in general, us included, that we demand that conversations happen along certain parameters, right? Because otherwise, we can really start having discussions that will take us to the moon and never come back. And with that in mind, it's that we wrote the paper that you just alluded to, and it's available in the Woodrow Wilson website. I will only stick to the principles, and I know Tony can elaborate on any of these. But from the general perspective, whatever the governments decide to do, either in 2026, but I would also argue that the decisions that will start coming out next week based on the new US administration position or not towards the USMCA, I believe that those decisions and the responses to them also need to be set by certain parameters, certain principles. And I believe that the principles described in the paper equally apply right now. The first principle that we outline in the paper is if it's not broken, don't try to fix it. In politics, there is always this tendency to try to find problems, right? And try to provide some solutions to those problems just in order to, politically have a win. And, there are several things working perfectly right in our relationship. I'm not saying that we cannot improve them. I'm just saying don't go around chasing non-existent problems to provide unnecessary solutions. Okay, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of energy, and clearly it's going to distract the government from what needs to be done. Second, let's not forget that the challenges that the region faces are coming from abroad. Again, I'm not saying that we cannot do things internally in North America, but right now, whether that is climate change or the competitiveness of other regions or the development of the technologies that we have, clearly there are other regions and other sources of those problems, not among ourselves. And again, in politics, we always tend to find that scapegoating exercise, and we see them time and again. And lastly, the third point, and I will stop here, is that if you consider the NAFTA and then the USMCA, we've been building the North American project, which is the title of another program that we worked on, Diego and myself. We've been building the North American project for more than 3 decades now. So yes, we know how to handle long-term projects. So we shouldn't really be content just with having a couple of ideas that will take a few months to complete or half complete, so as again to present them as political wins. We in North America must demand that if we are taking a deep dive in this endeavor, we have priorities and we have actions that will do the best that they can do, even if they take longer periods of time to mature. we've been doing that. It's nothing that we have not done in the past. And Ambassador, I don't know if you want to complement this with everything that we discussed leading to the paper.
Well, we did have a long discussion for the paper, and beforehand, Diego and I wrote a joint paper which started exploring some of these issues for USMCA in general, and then we took this a bit further and in some more detail. And I think you're right that we talked about these three basic principles that should guide what we're doing. Then within that, we talked about the importance of making sure that panel decisions are respected, that we could look at areas for potential revision, that we should review the scope of the agreement, and do a number of other things, all of which are very vital for going forward. And I do hope we'll agree on these basic principles and then sort of rules for action as we move forward in doing this. There's a lot of good that can be done. There's no question that there's been tremendous amount of benefit in the trade between the three countries. So now how can we take that benefit and make it better for all three of the countries going forward? And as Juan Carlos was saying, we can't do all of this right away. We can start us off with a couple of things that will get us going in a few things in the right direction. And then we just have to keep working it as we go forward. The key item, it seems to me, is keep working on it and not give up because one or two things are very hard. And that's one of the challenges I think that we face. And so then to go back to the first item that I mentioned to start off with, that means we have to get cooperation working in a couple of the other areas that are not directly trade related, but could be used to block that trade cooperation. That has to do with migration and crime, largely with Mexico. And then also Canada is brought into that, saying they should deal with these things too. And then we can get into a longer negotiation over the USMCA, over what we should do in the near term, and then what we have to prioritize as areas for work going forward. And I think dividing it up that way makes a lot of sense. Making progress on a regular basis to make this a better agreement is going to help all three countries if we can get it right. And there's no reason that we can't get this right as we move forward, it seems to me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And as Juan Carlos was saying, if it ain't broke, we don't have to fix it. We should actually protect the advances that we made so far. I want to move on to before I do the final questions, I want to do some Q&A. And I'm happy to see that there are plenty of questions coming in from Canada. So I want to ask Steve, specifically so there's a question regarding the role of Canadian provinces in international trade negotiations going forward. There's another question on Alberta and potentially restricting energy exports to the US. What do you think about those two?
Well, I think our desire is to have a united position that enjoys the support of all provinces and territories. That's the only way we can most strongly move forward. It is a concern that Alberta has taken a different position. It would have been better if those differences had been discussed in private rather than in public. I think it does weaken our position somewhat to have that kind of division. So I think we've got some work ahead of us to try to get some further unity in the Canadian position and some common cause.
Good. Another question from the Canadian perspective for Ambassador Hemingway. To what extent can the government respond without Parliament's involvement now that, we're in a very in an interesting time for Canadian politics? Are there any policies that come from like provinces again?
No, thank you. And of course, with Parliament prorogued, there is an impact there in terms of additional spending can't be passed while Parliament is prorogued, and I think that's only until March at this time, so we'll be back online before long. But in terms of direct impact, it could impact things like spending related to some of the demands we've seen coming out of the president-elect, for instance. But I don't see a direct impact on the actual review process beyond some of these issues that are around the edges of the discussions trilaterally and bilaterally. For now, and I know too, I think you mentioned about provinces being involved, and provinces are, deeply consulted on all of our trade discussions and negotiations, and they certainly do have an important role. And I think Steve was echoing that as well.
What's a realistic timeline for, the election of the new Liberal leadership and then the actual parliamentary election?
So in Canada's case, with the minority government, the government could fall due to a confidence vote at any time. That's the way our parliamentary system is set up. That's not going to happen. There won't be any votes while government is prorogued. So on that, in terms of timeline, the time to watch is when Parliament comes back to session in March.
Okay, interesting. I think, Shona, the thing that you mentioned about a win-win-win case, sorry, because we're three countries. How can we get to vision convergence and present this review as a win-win-win scenario for all three countries? Like, are other avenues that we're currently not talking about, but can those things potentially get us there? For example, last week I was talking to some friends about potentially going beyond just USMCA, for example, talk about joint export controls or joint trade remedy cases where we could show how Mexico, Canada, and the US can work together, not necessarily within the framework of USMCA, but can help build a common front, for example, against unfair trade practices from countries like China or from Russia.
Yeah, I think you've really hit the point there that sometimes we talk about complacency when things are going well. We live in the most prosperous region in the world with enormous potential, here in North America, and that could make us complacent, when things are going well. And so having a fresh look at our institutions, our structures, how we work together trilaterally is always positive. And I think we could look at some of those positive aspects. We're nervous, we're anxious, right? Because we have an agreement that's worked really well and brought prosperity to communities and people and families in all three countries. And I think we tend to focus on that anxiety that's produced, so we may lose some of what we've achieved. And at all costs, do no harm is the expression we go to, and we don't want to do harm. But I think, it is an opportunity, and we'll have to make sure that's part of the discussion, is looking at, what can be achieved. And I think for me, we talk about the effect of free trade agreements in terms of generating animal spirits, I think is the term we used to use, at least today. And it creates this impact on the region that we can't really explain in hard stats and figures as to why, we're coming together more, why our business leaders are working together more, why, our small and medium-sized businesses are having success in new markets. It's not immediately attributable to one line or one clause in the agreement, but it exists. And I think having these conversations, and again, the Wilson Center for convening this kind of discussion, is invaluable. And I think it's up to all of us involved just to make sure that those opportunities aren't lost or missed when we understandably get distracted by the risks that pose in opening up some of these discussions where we have something we want to protect, right? And we need to maintain that.
And the last question I want to ask about, as you said, anxiety-inducing measures. There are a lot of questions in the chat about the actual response from Canada and from Mexico to tariffs coming from the US. I want Juan Carlos and Steve to talk a little about the concept of a trade carousel and how would that look in real life? Which sort of products would Mexico or Canada target if they get tariffs put on their own goods? And how would the region look? How would that impact the credibility of USMCA?
You want to go first, Steve?
Sure. Well, I think we have to start from the premise that the application of 25% tariffs against all products from Canada and Mexico is a huge blow to USMCA and a huge blow to our confidence in the US as an ally. This is a very aggressive action, and we're going to have to respond. From Canada's perspective, probably our most effective levers are going to be on the resource sector, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's oil and gas. But the result is that the way it looks to us is that the U.S. is going to put much stronger barriers against us to the U.S. market than they are to China and Venezuela and others. Does the U.S. really want to start buying these essential resources from those countries as compared to Canada, who has been a loyal ally to the U.S. throughout all of this? And from Canada's perspective, we're far better to go down the track of trying to strengthen North America as a region. We can be the most powerful region in the world if we get our act together, but we've got to try to dissuade the U.S. away from this go it alone kind of approach. We're far stronger together as a region than we are as individual countries, and that's the challenge we have going forward.
Yeah, that should be one of your main takeaways. Juan Carlos, what do you think?
I think that the response on Mexico's part will depend on what the US does. And what I'm trying to say is that if the most radical idea, meaning 25% blanket tariff across the board, I would expect the Mexican government to respond equally, exactly as the US did. Now, if the US does impose tariffs, but it's only in a few sectors and not to the 25% but lower, that it's not going to be much more acceptable rather than the blanket tariff. It will be equally worrisome, as Steve says. It would also be a substantial blow to the credibility of the USMCA. And I would argue as well that it will be a breach of the U.S. obligations in the U.S. because one element that I haven't seen a lot mentioned earlier is that even here in Mexico, right, is all this discussion about what we are going to do if Trump sets tariffs, but very randomly, very, very seldom do I see that the U.S. is violating the USMCA by doing that. So at the same time that Mexico responds in the degree that they consider needs to be responded, I would also expect Mexico to launch a USMCA dispute settlement panel against the U.S. Because of that. And again, some people might argue there's no point. The U.S. is going to ignore the ruling anyway, as it has done in the case of automotive and auto parts. But again, I cannot speak for Canada, but certainly Mexico cannot go around breaching its obligations and then expect other countries to behave. So we really have to stick to that track and proceed as we should. Now, what sectors, what products, what tariff level? I mean, we don't really know. In the past, Mexico, when Mexico applied or retaliated against the U.S. for several reasons, twice, in fact, there's an exercise of picking up which are the products that will be targeted. Some of those reasons or the rationale for some of those picking of products, some of that it's entirely political. I remember that a few years ago when we set the tariffs, a certain gentleman from Kentucky was a prominent figure in Congress, and obviously Mexico targeted bourbon, right? There are other, I won't bother the audience with the details. There are other conditions as well that play a role in deciding, what is the inflation likely to cause? Can we obtain a supply of that product from a third party so as not to increase inflation? The most advanced or structured models, they also make the calculations of the elasticity of the products, so on and so forth. But again, we just don't know, right? I guess that the important point is, in my mind at least, Mexico, without a doubt, will retaliate, and very likely it will be in the same degree that the U.S. decides to do that. But I would also expect that Mexico keeps the moral ground on this and initiates a dispute settlement panel on the auspices of the USMCA.
Mm-hmm. No, I think to wrap up both of your responses, I think the real winners from a tariff war in North America are China and Russia. Tariffs again undermine the credibility of the agreement. They'll make avocados more expensive for US consumers. For your avocado toast, they'll make auto parts more expensive for Mexican. They'll make agricultural products more expensive for Canadian families. So really no one's winning here. And I think Ambassador Wayne, you talked about compliance issues, and we haven't talked about the auto panel that the US lost, and they lost over 2 years ago, and they haven't said how they're going to go back into compliance. Mexico lost its first USMCA panel in December regarding the trade of agricultural products, specifically corn. And there hasn't been any response as to how Mexico is going to go back into compliance on that case as well. What does non-compliance mean for USMCA? And is there a way forward to get past these issues?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think there does have to be a cost to not complying. And I think that has to be part of the dialogue going forward. And in that sense, I want to add that it's not only going to be Canadian companies and Mexican companies that respond to this lack of compliance. It's going to be US companies that are the partners of these companies from Canada and from Mexico that are clearly benefiting from the collaboration that is going on and aren't going to want to see that undermined. And I think that that's going to be an important factor here too. If you remember back to the first negotiation, when US farmers started weighing in and say, well, wait a minute, you're going to cut off all of our trade with our two neighbors. That's going to be terribly costly to us. I think that's true. There are a lot of US actors that are gaining a tremendous amount positively from the current arrangements. Sure, they can see some things improved. They'd like to have some more openings, but they don't want it ended. And I think that all the negotiators, but particularly the US negotiator and particularly President Trump, have to keep that in mind. He's going to get a little space because he's just starting off here. But if he starts raising prices and raising supply problems for US companies, that's going to be very costly to him, and people are going to remember it. And so I think we have to keep in mind that this has costs on everybody. And what Trump does is going to have costs for him politically. And he has a lot of supporters from states that are gaining a lot in the trade with different parts of North America, with Mexico and Canada. So when you satisfy people on issues, you've got to satisfy all the people gaining from this and make it easier to have more trade and to have more benefit that goes on. And I think that we tend to forget that when we sort of look at, well, somebody's not doing this, so we have to get them back. Well, but a lot of other people are doing things that, as you pointed out, and as Leila pointed out in her initial comments, trade has grown substantially in the last few years. And there's no reason that it can't keep growing and can't bring more benefit to all three of the countries. And that we've got to keep that in mind and keep pushing with that common good goal. And that will be from US actors as well as from actors in Canada and Mexico. It's not just going to be Canada and Mexico alone speaking in favor of finding agreement on a number of these issues.
Excellent. There are a few questions regarding China on the chat. Is anyone willing to offer some comments on China's role in the review?
Well, I think I'm going to say that all those people, I think, favoring a successful outcome of the review are going to argue that you've got to deal with China in doing that. And you have to be praiseful of Mexico as for what they've said, not what they've done. Now, what they've said is a good thing. What they've done is not so good in some instances. But I think what you want to get is a united approach by Mexico, the United States, and Canada to China trying to take advantage of this, trying to take advantage of its special attributes that its companies selling to other parts of the world now have, and to respond to that in an effective way. And that there is an effective response to Chinese sales, whether they're coming into the United States directly, into Canada, into Mexico. There's an effective response of dealing with them and actually making North American production from all three countries a much better competitor. And I think that's where the three countries have to get together and work on this. And I think they will. And I think all of them are going to have to be just quite blunt. And the private sector is going to have to be blunt in talking about what the role of China should be here.
Thank you, Ambassador Wayne. Final question. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for sending their questions. We got almost 40 questions. I think we answered as many as we could, but time is running out. Final yes or no question. Will USMCA survive its review in 2026? Yes or no? Ambassador Hemingway, what do you think?
Yes, until and unless we have a win-win-win, a spectacular solution, why would we would just be foolish, no, to destroy what we've created together. So yes.
A spectacular review for a spectacular trade agreement. Ambassador Wayne, what do you think?
I think we will get there. I think there'll be a lot of tough negotiating. There'll be a lot of efforts to get different people to give up on different things. But I do think we're going to get to an agreement. And I look forward to that process.
Juan Carlos, what do you think?
We will definitely continue to have the USMCA. There's no scenario in my mind where that disappears. But I believe that I don't want to extend too much on this. But if we are having, and this goes back to China and several of the things that we are happening here, we happen to be speaking here. If we are going to have a future USMCA that really responds to the needs of the region and so on, I just really hope that we are having, or that conversation is held under rational, serious parameters. And the China point actually is one great to illustrate all of this. I will be the last person to defend China. And those of you that know me, you know the remarks that I've done in the past. But I mean, China is our second largest partner of the three countries, actually. That implies a substantial amount of supply that cannot be replaced overnight. So I'm all for having that discussion, right? But pointing fingers and Mexico is doing this and Canada is doing more to be aligned with the US, and then we knew the response that it brought. I mean, come on, that is not serious. If we want to talk about North American industrial policy, if we want, why not to have a on China chapter in the USMCA post 2026? I'm all for it. But let's have that discussion seriously, with actual facts, with the forward-looking vision that the paper suggests, not because of the politics. If not, we're just going to miss the target again.
I agree completely, and I want to just check out the paper. I think it's a good paper. It's on the event site if you want to check it out. Steve, will we get an unanimous decision here? Do you think that USMCA will survive in 2026?
I think it's in the interest of all three countries that USMCA survives, and I certainly hope that we all agree to pursue that kind of direction. If not, we're going to be in a worse place. So I hope common sense prevails.
So we get 4 yeses. Excellent. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to ask Chris the same question, but I'll hand him the virtual microphone so that he can close out the event. Thank you so much, Chris. We couldn't have done this without your leadership and support.
Well, thank you very much, Diego. And since I've been a fly on the wall here, it has been a delight to hear from Ambassador Shauna Hemingway, Ambassador Tony Wayne, from great trade negotiators like Juan Carlos Baker and Steve Verhoeven, talking about these issues. And Diego, you're a wonderful moderator, so you've kept the conversation interesting, but also added your own commentary, which I appreciate. My big takeaway from this event is that if the three North American countries want to make North America work, we're blessed by having the kind of experts who could make it work. And that's a general comment, regardless of what the objectives of our political leadership are. If we need to have true free trade, if we need to have manage trade, if we need to resolve particularly sticky wickets, there are people with goodwill and real smarts who are capable of delivering that. And I think too often we have these conversations where it's the trade negotiators and the experts and the ambassadors who are supposedly thwarting the will of the public. Not at all. And we may have to see what our political calculations are, but whatever it is the people decide, whatever it is our leadership decides, I think we can achieve it. I agree with every one of the panelists, and I'm delighted that you all were able to share this conversation with us and with the Wilson Center's audience. So with that, thank you very much. I'm pleased to close out this event. And if you're watching, please join us for future events. And as several people have said, check out the paper that these wonderful panelists have collaborated on, looking at how we might approach this review. We can approach it a lot of different ways, but we should not approach it ill-informed. And thanks to the Wilson Center, you won't, just as long as you read the paper, not just look at the cover. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Gracias a todos. Merci.